Hi, this is Robert Sungenis coming to you once again on the Principal Facebook page for August 29th, 2019. We are setting aside this hour from 7 to 8 Eastern Daylight Time to take your questions, comments, concerns, whatever you have of science in general, basically topics like creationism versus evolution, geocentrism versus heliocentrism, any kind of verses that you want to talk about in science today. Special relativity, general relativity, Isaac Newton, Galileo, Copernicus, all those things that are sometimes considered esoteric topics by people in the populace. But that greatly affect our life, intellectually, sometimes morally, and definitely religiously. And I don't think I have to elaborate on those for those of you in the know. I want to do a little advertisement, as I have done in the past, for our books and movies. First of all, I want to say that I put up a new YouTube. I took down the old one, which was the movie called Fool on the Hill. It was doing very well, but I suddenly had an inkling to change the title of that and add a few more things, which I did. So I put up another YouTube. Unfortunately, all the visits to the movie that are calculated, I think there were close to 4,000 in a 3-week period, they're all lost. So that's one thing you get when you put up a new video or replace the old one with YouTube. You lose all the counts that you had. But I was rather moved by the fact that there were a lot of views to The Fool on the Hill. I did change the title, and I think it's much more appropriate considering the length of time that we spent on Albert Einstein in that video, to change the title to Einstein, the Closet Geocentrist. And that title alone is an attractive title, friend or foe, religious or not, religious or secular, because basically we're saying something that somebody else has never said. And it needs to be said that this whole thing about geocentrism basically stems, pro and con, from Albert Einstein, what the world considers, or who the world considers their greatest scientist. So anyway, the YouTube is up under that title. And I also want to reemphasize the Principal DVD, still for sale, selling well all over the world. And that movie, again, appeared in theaters in 2014. And starring some very famous physicists. You know them by name: Michio Kaku, Lawrence Krauss, the whole crowd. We've got as many in there as we could possibly fit in an hour and a half, and we let them tell their story, and that story, in at least a good portion of the time, is a geocentric story, whether they like to tell it straightforwardly or not. That is the story, and we can talk about that a little bit tonight if you'd like. Also, there is the sequel to that, Journey to the Center of the Universe, a 4.5-hour documentary taking off where the Principal left off, and goes into great detail on how to put all these things together. And I hope you, if you haven't already, buy a copy of that. We also have my new book that I wrote for a specific audience. It's titled Geocentrism for Dumbskies and Smart Kids. as you can see, I took off on the theme of the dummies books. And I just want everybody to know that titles are not copyrightable, so don't worry about that title. Besides, it's Dumbskis, not Dummies. So it's a change there. I think this is probably one of my best efforts to make this topic as succinct and as easily understandable and as comprehensive as I could in about 250 pages. And let me see if I can flip through here. There's color pages all throughout. There's Bart Simpson. You know, all color pages all throughout. So it's well put together, and the font is large enough so everybody can read it. You don't have to squint your eyes, and you know, and I use little emojis almost on every page. There's our friend Michio Kaku and Bernard Carr from the Principal movie. So anyway, that is available, and as I said, I think one of my best efforts to make this thing as easy to understand as possible, so something that a kid would enjoy reading. So if you have some children that are interested in science, this is a must for them. Okay, it's a must before they go to high school and take all their science courses. If they're so endowed, they need to know the side of the story from, you know, the Christian perspective. So there you have it. I also made another book that's a little shorter. What's this? Probably 125 pages, called The First 4 Days of Creation. Good for your children who, you know, are puzzled about how to understand the first 4 days of Genesis. Because, you know, the earth is created first, then the firmament, then the vegetation, and then the sun and stars and the moon. And, you know, a lot of people who think they know better say, well, that's all backwards. You know, obviously the world couldn't be created that way. Even God wouldn't create it that way, you know, with everything backwards, so to speak. And, well, no is the answer to that, of course. And that's explained in this book here, The First 4 Days of Creation. And that also is all filled with color pictures. You know, so it's quite attractive. I'm trying to get the best angle here. And so that's available for them. And it's quite a good read. Again, the print's big, and you know, I think it's very enjoyable reading for, I think, ages, let's say 10 and up. I made this especially for them. I remember a mother, gosh, about 6 years ago, wrote to me and says, you know, would you please make a book for, I'm a homeschooler, and I would like a book that I could go to teach my kids geocentrism on a very elementary level. Well, I took a long time in answering your question, but these two books, again, First 4 Days and Geocentrism for Dummies and Smart Kids, was made because of that request. And then for you big boys, we got, you know, Geocentrism 101. You know, this is like high school level on up. Not color pictures in this, but still a good buy for those who are interested in the subject. And then we have the big daddies for those that, you know, are college level, PhDs, all the way up. Galileo was wrong. This was the original that came out in 2005, I believe, was the first edition. It's now in its 12th edition. And somebody asked me one time, she goes, well, why do you have to make so many additions? Did you make so many mistakes that you have to go in there and correct them all? And I said, no, it's because we find more information, and actually find a lot of information as the years go on, or new ways to explain things. And but basically, and that information has to be verified, and it has to be essential to the arguments for us to, make a whole new edition of it. But that's happened at least 12 times. So, because it's in its 12th edition now. And this comes in 3 volumes. This is volume 1, and you can see that's about 700 and some odd pages long. And volume 2 is like 600 and some odd. And volume 3 deals with the history between the church and this whole subject of science, particularly cosmology, dealing with the Galileo issue, and all the way up to Pope John Paul II and his talk in 1992 to the Pontifical Academy of Science, and everything in between. So if you're a history buff and you want to know what the history is, I try to uncover every rock and look into every wrinkle of the issue and explain it, as it should be explained to those who believe that the church was right and Galileo was wrong. Okay. Now, of course, I have my critics. First of all, there are those who say, why do you need to cover this topic in the first place? I mean, is that where we really live on Earth? Do we worry about, what's going around what up there? Well, yes, we do. That's why our scientists today are so famous. Look at Stephen Hawking. He's practically a god, a saint. He just died a couple years ago. Albert Einstein. Just think of it. Isaac Newton. These are the icons of society, because they are supposed to have set the record straight for us about how the cosmos was really made. And don't bother with that Bible of yours, because as anyone can tell by reading the first chapter of Genesis, it's all cockeyed and actually the reverse of what it should be. You see, that's what we're told today. So the combatants could not be any more diverse in their particular views today of science as opposed to the Bible. And of course, you got the whole subject of evolution and creation. If Genesis 1 is cockeyed, and how could you say that that's the way God created the world? Isn't evolution better than that, and much more scientific and logical and blah, blah, blah? Well, no. Okay. Again, what society purports to be the truth and something more logical actually turns out to be very illogical. I mean, imagine that a man like me talking to you in verbal expressions of highly intellectual material came from a monkey who can't even form one word, much less write books, create art, love, and all those things that are essential to what a human being is. And science actually tells us the reverse. By this little law called the second law of thermodynamics, which can be expanded to fit a lot of other areas, that the complex does not come from something simple. Okay, if there's something complex that's existing, it will break down into its simplicities given enough time. So it's just the reverse. Science basically tells us just the reverse of what evolution purports. They purport that it starts simple and it gets more complex. Well, that's just the opposite of their own law. Okay, so live with that. But those contradictions just sort of, they just go way over because they have an agenda. And that agenda is to take God off the stage, to take the Bible off the stage, because they get in the way. The Bible and the church, they get in the way of the kind of lifestyle we want to live. We don't like to be told, not to commit adultery, not to divorce, and not to engage in sexual activity outside of marriage. We don't like that. So let's just get rid of the source that told us that, and then we can all live, our happy lives and not be encumbered by someone pricking our conscience and making us think that there's a God out there who's watching us. every move we make. You know, the only way to get rid of that is to get rid of the people who told you about it, and that's the church and the Bible. So that's why these things are so important. So to answer that lady's question, yeah, it might be esoteric in the sense not in your everyday living, but these things affect you. It's the same with philosophy. You know, I mean, why do we study philosophy? Why do we have to go through, you know, Descartes and David Hume and Immanuel Kant and Friedrich Hegel and Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus and all these philosophers? Well, this is what happens in society. The philosophers give us the intellectual ideas, and they remain in the sort of intellectual atmosphere for, they could remain there a century before they actually filter down into society and become part and parcel with the society and affect your everyday living. Okay, it doesn't happen automatically. It takes a while. But once it's situated in the society, we live by it, and a lot of times we don't even know why we're living by these particular principles. Well, it's because those philosophers told us about 100 or 200 years before us that this is the way things work, and then they filter down into society. Okay, you know, just take the Hegelian dialectic as one example. You know, Hegel had this idea that you have a thesis, and then you have an antithesis, and then as they combat each other, it forms a synthesis, as they call it. And this is the way life works. You know, you have one idea, it's opposed by another idea, and they reach sort of a compromise, and you have the synthesis. And this Hegelian dialectic has basically been ruling society for the last, what, 200-300 years or so. Okay, where did it come from? It came from this German philosopher, all right? And he came after Immanuel Kant. And why was he so special? Well, Immanuel Kant basically told us that the very reason, the reason that philosophers were using to arrive at their theories was corrupt, because the reason, he wrote a book called The Critique of Pure Reason. And after Kant's book, basically philosophy fell apart because they couldn't base their ideas on reason anymore. And why was that the case? Well, Kant told them that basically you couldn't distinguish between what was in your head and what was outside, what was occurring outside. You couldn't make the connection that what you saw outside of your head was actually a reality that your head did not already create, you see? And so he basically psychologized philosophy to the point where you basically didn't know that what you were thinking or what you thought was reality is actually reality, because there was no way to connect your inner thoughts to the objective world outside. Okay, so basically philosophy fell apart and society started to fall apart. And you see this in the, let's say, the architecture, the paintings of the great artists I'm talking about. Okay, I'm talking about the Rembrandts and the Michelangelos and all the other great artists that we've had. You see it in music. You see it in culture. You know, anything where man expresses his own ideas, it starts with the philosophy and then filters its way down into society through all these channels. Art, as I said, music, architecture, all those things, movies, books, you see all these things happening, okay? So this is how the esoteric world of philosophy affects us without us sometimes even knowing it, as I said. But this is why it's important to study philosophy, because you have to know where these things are coming from. And then what they try to do, like, for example, this Hegelian dialectic, they try to apply it to the church or the Bible. For example, the famous theory, I think it was either Hegel or someone who followed him, said that the way the church was formed was by the fact that Peter had a certain set of ideas, philosophical ideas, and then Paul came along with his sort of counter ideas. That's the antithesis of the thesis that Peter had said, and that the church reached a compromise between Peter and Paul, and then made, law, canon law, or sacraments or practices or theological ideas based on the compromise that was reached between the ideas of Peter and Paul, you see. So you see how this philosophical idea can greatly affect how you even view the church, all right? And that's what men do. They develop a philosophy and then they try to universalize it to make it apply to all of life, as if this philosophy is the answer to life. But then what will happen is someone else will come along and say, nah, you got it wrong. Here's the way it is. And so he'll cancel the philosopher that went before him, and he'll create a whole new idea. And then that will go for a while, 50, 75 years or so, and then someone else will come along, and he'll have a better idea. And now we have a new philosophy, and that's how we got to existentialism. And that's basically I give up philosophy. Basically it says we'll never really understand what life's all about. That becomes a philosophy. That we'll never understand it. And all the guys that pretended to understand it before us are wrong, okay? So again, this is why topics like cosmology, when you talk about creationism or science and things like that are very important. And so anyway, that's why I set aside this time to talk about these things for those of you who are interested. And tell your friends and relatives about this. And as far as I know, it's the only kind of program there is like that, where we get to talk about these highfalutin ideas and kick them around and see how they affect our lives and how they affect our faith. All right, so let's see. We got some questions here. Ben, how you doing, Ben? Hi, Robert. Is time travel possible? If so, how would it work? Are there any documented cases of it actually happening? Thank you for all your great work. Okay. No, time travel is not possible. This whole idea about time warping and space warping and all this stuff. And I'm glad you asked this question, because it leads right, believe it or not, it leads right back to the geocentrism issue. Okay, that's where it all started. And that's why this, again, is so important. All right. And I'll tell you the little story. I'll try to make it short, but you need to know this. I mean, if you're talking about time travel, you need to know the source of it. Okay. So here's the source of it. And after I'm done, try not to laugh, but just tuck it away and realize this is how men think. Men who are blind, who don't know where they're going or what they're doing, without revelation, without God telling them, they get stuck in these paradigms, and these paradigms lead to absurd things like time travel. Okay. As you know, and I've said it, 1,000 times, if not more, that, in 1887, Michelson and Morley performed an experiment with light beams. And they made these light beams crisscross, and I won't get into all that right now, but basically that machine that they built, called an interferometer, was built to detect the Earth moving in space. Okay? And they measured, they knew how light traveled, and they measured how much of a disruption that a light beam discharged in the so-called direction of the Earth going around the sun would affect the light beam. Okay, and that's easy to calculate. It's not magic. I put all the math in my book, Galileo Was Wrong. All right, so they knew exactly how this light beam should be affected if the Earth was moving through space. And what happened was they did not see any effect. Okay, so they had two choices as the result of this experiment. Their first choice was the obvious one. The Earth ain't moving. That's why we didn't detect any, difference in the light beam, because the Earth isn't moving. We assumed that it was moving, but the experimental evidence shows it's not moving. Okay, but we're modern men. We can't have that. Obviously, that answer has to be wrong. All right. So, are they acting like scientists? No, because a true scientist would never throw out the most obvious result of the experiment, even if you want to call it hypothetical. Okay? The most obvious result is the fact that my light beam wasn't affected because the Earth isn't moving to affect it. Okay? So, it was real simple. But as I said, as modern men, we can't have that because Copernicus already told us that the Earth is going around the sun. So that must be the case, although he never proved it, and neither did Galileo, and neither did Newton for that matter. Okay? He just gave us a bunch of equations that, if it was true, these equations would fit, but it didn't prove that the fact that the Earth was going around the sun. All right? So, so that was choice A, that the Earth isn't moving. Choice B was, well, maybe the light beam was affected, and maybe that the actual machine that we used was affected by the space it was traveling in, so that the machine shrank as it moved. So what's wrong with that proposition already? What's wrong with it is, first of all, you're assuming that the Earth is moving, and you don't know that. I mean, you're actually you're devising an experiment to show you whether the Earth is moving or not, all right? And the experiment prima facie says, no, it's not moving, but you still assume it's moving, and if that's the case, then the light beam has to be affected, okay? And if it's not affected, that means, well, we're going to have to change the length that it travels and the time that it travels, you see, because you're basically stuck in a corner, all right? If you're not going to say that the Earth is motionless and that's what caused the results of the experiment, you're going to have to say that the length and the time change, all right? And what was Einstein's famous, phrase? Time dilation. Time dilation, that as if time could actually change. Okay? So in other words, instead of accepting what the Bible and the church had said, that the answer to this experiment is the Earth isn't moving, we'll change time. And so as soon as you say that time can change, it can get longer or shorter, all right, then what have you done? Well, you've opened up Pandora's box. Because now that means that you can have, theoretically, time travel. Okay? Because if a moving object dilates the time for that object, well, let's just reverse course. Let's just say that we dilate the time so that the object is affected. All right? And if we dilate it enough or change it enough so that we can put the object in a different time. Okay? That's where that all comes from. It was one mistake after the other. Okay? So time is time. Time never changes. Okay? Whether you have an accurate clock or not, who cares? All right? The clock is just calibrating the passage of time. But it has nothing to do with time itself. Okay? Time is time. Time passes whether we like it or not. We've been here for how long now? We've been here for a half hour, 30 minutes. Okay? That's time. And the idea that I could either make this longer or shorter, or that I could be transported to a different time, it's all absolute fantasy. And it's absolute fantasy because it was created by the absolute mistake that they made in interpreting the Michelson-Morley experiment. Okay? Because it's all special relativity. And special relativity is a theory that talks about dilating time and all this stuff, okay? Now, general relativity plays a little part in that because, you know, gravity is supposed to warp space, and if you warp space, you warp time, and all this stuff, okay? But that's, and again, that's just a theory, all right? And people have glommed on this because they had nothing else to hold on to, all right? They had nothing. There's nobody else that's come along and given us a handle to even know what gravity is, okay? And Einstein didn't know what gravity was. He just said that objects warp space. Well, how does that happen? How do they warp space? What in the mechanism, what in the object is causing it to warp space? You know, just labeling it and saying, well, it's gravity, that doesn't answer the question, okay? And that's why science is, you know, basically hasn't gotten out of the starting blocks yet. Because if you can't explain something as simple as gravity and where that comes from, what is it? You haven't answered anything, okay? And basically all of life and all of motion, all of what we see out there, all depends on gravity, all right? So if you don't know what it is, you can have all the equations in the world you want, and all they are is little labels showing you how gravity, you know, affects things, but not what it is. And so that's a basic fundamental question. But getting back to the idea now is that, no, time travel is not possible. You heard it here first. And I can show you the history of it, why it's not possible, and where this crazy idea came from. But it sells well, though, doesn't it? I mean, what would Star Trek be without time travel? I mean, think about it. You know, William Shatner would just not have his career. And, you know, and Spock would be just another thing that came one day and went the next. All right? But our whole idea has been built on, wow, is time travel possible? Okay? No. But that's boring, though, isn't it? You know, gosh, man. Come on, Sungenis. You're just drawing too many limits around us. All right? Well, yeah, there's a reason why I do that. Is because I want to corral you to not go outside the margins that God gave us, because the reason for life is not out there somewhere. Okay? We're here for a very short time, and we're basically biding our time, passing the time to get to the real place. Yeah. If you want to talk about time travel, that's the one you want to talk about. Okay? Where there is no more time anymore, so to speak, because now we're in eternity, and it's never going to end. Okay? That's where we want to go. All right? And that's not fiction. That's real. All right? So all this talk that I give about this stuff is for one purpose only, and that's to get us to that place where it's timeless, if you want to use that term. Okay? All right, Ben, I think I spent enough time on that. Kate says, I am loving all this new content coming from you, Dr. Sungenis. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Well, thank you, Kate. And yeah, I'm finally happy that I got the opportunity to talk to you guys instead of just writing books. You know, I gave a lot of debates and all that kind of stuff, but it didn't talk to you. And that's what I really enjoy about this. And as you can tell, once you get me going on something, yeah, it's just like a flood that comes forth. It's probably been under wraps for quite a few years. So thank you, Kate, for the opportunity to do this, because without you, it wouldn't be possible. So I return the thanks to you. All right, Adam says, given the global flood and Noah's Ark, why are kangaroos, for example, exclusively here in Australia? We have some kangaroos here in the United States, Adam. Kangaroo courts, things like that. That's just my attempt at a joke. Let me get serious with you. Well, we used to have, in the beginning, this landmass, one landmass called Pangea. Okay, so basically all the continents were one landmass on one side of the earth, and the other was just water. Okay, and then at the flood, as Genesis chapter 7 and 8 tell us, the fountains of the deep were broken up. Now, what that entails would be that the crust of the earth is broken, cracked, let's say, so that the water underneath can spew forth. That's where most of the water came. And it also rained, of course, for 40 days, 40 nights, and that gave an additional amount of water. But most of the water came from the earth itself, which solves the problem of where did all the water come from? Okay, well that answers that question. So when you have water, and you know how much damage water can do, how much pressure water can create. I mean, just think, was it Hurricane Dorian is down there in Florida, and if you've already seen the damage, you see how water can push land masses. And that's what happened. In order to allow this water to come up from beneath the Earth's surface, these land masses in Pangea had to be separated. But as you separate them, you create inertia. And inertia is the tendency of an object to remain in motion once it's been put in motion. And so once this water coming up from the bottom spread out these land masses, the sheer inertia of those land masses is going to push those land masses or continents away from each other now. And they won't stop until that inertia subsides, either by friction, climate, whatever it is, that finally makes that inertia subside and go down to zero. And that happened after the flood, many years after the flood. And so we have the land masses that we have today. So that's why Australians got caught down, near the bottom of the earth, because there was a lot of inertia pushing your continent away from that original landmass. Okay, so as far as kangaroos were concerned, let's just say that in Pangea, the kangaroos were in a certain location in that large landmass. Okay, so when that particular part of that Pangea broke off, which we now call Australia, okay, it carried the kangaroos with it. Okay, whatever animal was indigenous to that area in Pangea was going to stick with that landmass when that landmass broke off from Pangea and went down to the southern hemisphere where you are now. Okay, so I guess the same thing would be true for what are those animals you have down there? The sloths, I think, are indigenous to Australia. There's a few other animals that you guys have down there. So that's what would have happened, okay? As opposed to, the saber-toothed tiger, was indigenous to the eastern part of Pangea. So when that landmass broke off, they carried the saber-toothed tiger up to that part of the earth, okay? And so that's why we have different animals in each, not totally different, but we have distinctive animals in each quadrant of the earth because of that, of Noah's flood, pushing the land masses away, okay? So let me see if we have any other questions here. Jonathan says, Robert, I know you've covered this before, but can you go into what specifically Galileo was condemned for? Had this question on my YouTube uploaded yesterday. Okay, Galileo was condemned for basically saying that the earth moved, okay? And he was condemned in two ways. And there was another wrinkle I should mention before I get into this, that Galileo was the first to basically say that we could reinterpret Scripture apart from how the fathers interpreted it to arrive at the fact that the Bible would allow a heliocentric universe. Not many people know this about Galileo, but he put his mind to Bible interpretation as much as he did to science. And so Galileo would write a passage on Joshua chapter 10, and he would explain away the obvious geocentric theme running through that chapter, and he would try to make it heliocentric. And if I remember correctly, his solution was, well, Joshua stopped the earth from turning. Okay. He would reinterpret Psalm 19. And I have a whole thing on Galileo's interpretation of Psalm 19, why that shouldn't be interpreted literally. And this is exactly what they're going to have to do, because the Bible is crystal clear, if read at face value, that the earth doesn't move and the sun and the stars go around it. All right? I don't think there's too many people who disagree with that. If you just take the Bible at face value, prima facie, okay, that's what it teaches. All right? So you have to come in and with some kind of sophisticated hermeneutic that changes the literal words of the Bible into words that can be either figuratized, allegorized, metamorphized, whatever eyes you want to put on there, to make it say something that it's not saying at face value. All right? And Galileo knew this. He was smart enough to figure it out, that his biggest obstacle was going to be the Bible. And you know how much stock the church put in the Bible. I mean, all her doctrines are made from the Bible. Almost all of them. Very few of them are not made from the Bible. And that all depends on what the interpretation is that you put on the Bible. You know, we said before, when Jesus says, "This is my body, take and eat," well, you got two choices. Did he mean that literally, or did he mean it symbolically? You know, which one is it? And, you know, as a matter of fact, the one that sounds the most logical, if you want to go by, you know, a human perspective, is the symbolic one. Okay? I mean, Jesus died, rose again. All right, why can't I just symbolize that with a piece of bread, you know? Big deal. All right? And so you can see why a lot of people would be tempted toward that interpretation. But the question is that right? And the Catholic Church's answer is no, that's dead wrong. As a matter of fact, that interpretation will land you in hell. It's the literal interpretation that's the right one. All right? And this is what Catholic hermeneutic has been from its inception. The fathers were not afraid to take these passages literally, and they didn't care whether you could figure it out or not. The only guy that really came to the closest to figuring it out was Thomas Aquinas, and that was 1,200 years after Jesus had the Last Supper. 1,200 years it took him to even have a reasonable explanation of what might be occurring to make us be allowed to interpret these words literally. Okay? Now, granted, the Latins used words that talked about a change from the bread to another substance, but they didn't really understand what was going on. They just labeled it and said, hey, if Jesus said it, it happened, and here's the word I can put on it. Like the Greek fathers used to put the word metaousios on that. Ousios is being or substance, and meta is change. So you had a change of substance. That's all that word meant. Okay? A change in substance. That's great. Okay? They're on the right track. But nobody really knew what was going on. Okay? And whether Aquinas himself knew what was going on, I mean, he borrowed those terms from Aristotle, of substance and accidents. Whether that's the reality or not, we're not quite sure. You know, is that the best mental representation that we can come up with? Well, so far, yes. And that's why the church accepted. But it doesn't mean that it's the exact, you know, replica of what's happening there. But the point, in fact, is that these fathers were not afraid to take those words literally. Okay? And the same with baptism. You know, water baptism in John 3:5. Unless a man is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. Well, how important is that water? You know, I mean, here's another case. Either that water is symbolic or that water is literal, in the sense that it's the means of grace, that it's not just a representation of something that's going on. It actually causes something to happen. And that's what the church had believed, you see, that the water actually causes the grace of God from the Spirit of God to come into your soul and cleanse it. Okay, and that's why it was necessary. All right, and so some people will look at us and say, man, you Catholics. And you talk about, you know, the fundamentalists, as the Protestant fundamentalists, they're always straddled with this idea of, you're a fundamentalist because you interpret the Bible literally. Well, you know who the first fundamentalists were? The Catholics. Okay? Anybody who takes this is my body and says that it's literal and that we're actually to eat Jesus's flesh in the sacrament because it's become his body and it's no longer bread, how literal can you get? I mean, that's literal. It's so literal, it's like funny to some people. The Jews used to accuse the Catholics of, you know, being cannibals because they claimed this. All right? But that's the substance of our faith. You see, and that's what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and 2. He says, God chose the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And that's exactly what the Eucharist is. To the world, it's foolish. Okay? And they think they're so wise in saying, well, it couldn't happen that way. And they do the same thing with the cosmology. When the Bible says the earth doesn't move, the fathers took it literally. Why? Because that's their hermeneutic that they use to interpret the whole Bible. Unless, of course, the Bible led them in a different way. Okay? You know, like when it says the trees started clapping their hands, well, that's obviously a metaphor. Because the trees don't have hands. Anybody can figure that out. All right? But the fact is, when they come across something, unless it was, well, actually, we can't say that. I was going to say unless it's impossible to interpret literally, because science doesn't say that it's possible for bread to turn into the body of a divine being. Okay? And the fathers just said, well, the heck with that. Who cares what science says? Who cares whether they think it's possible or not? This is what our Lord said, so it must be possible. Because he can't lie. That's the key. God can't lie. So if God says water is needed and the earth doesn't move, well, God can't lie. You see. So unless you have some good reason to interpret that other than literally, you're on the wrong track. And that's what the church said to Galileo. You're on the wrong track, Galileo. Our whole history, 1,600 years before you, has done nothing but interpret the Bible at face value, because it's the Word of God and God can't lie. Okay? So that was his big problem. And the church came in two statements and said, to say that the sun doesn't move and does not go from east to west is formally heretical. Okay? Formally heretical. It said that twice, in 1616 under Pope Pius V, or Pope Paul V, and in 1633 under Pope Urban VIII. Formally heretical. And then it had another statement and said, to say that the earth moves is at least erroneous in faith and philosophically absurd. And when they used the word philosophically there, they meant scientifically. Okay, it's erroneous in faith. Why? Well, because the Bible doesn't say that the earth moves. And it's philosophically or scientifically absurd. Why? Well, because if the sun is the one that's moving from east to west, obviously the earth can't be moving from east to west. Okay, and it also added and rotating on its axis, diurnal rotation. All right, that's what he was condemned for saying. And Galileo gave in. As a matter of fact, he was given an injunction by the church. That's a legal document that says you must do whatever is on this piece of paper for the rest of your life, unless we rescind it. And that was, you cannot talk about heliocentrism, you cannot teach it, you cannot write about it, you cannot think about it. Okay? Whatever they can put on there, they put on there. Don't mess with this, Galileo. All right? And so, time went by, and, popes come and go. And so another pope got into office, who actually was Cardinal Barberini in the 1610s, and was on Galileo's side, believe it or not. And then he became Pope in 1623, and he became Pope Urban VIII. Yeah, I think it was 1623. Or was that when Galileo started writing his book? Well, anyway, I think it was. Galileo started writing the book that got him eventually condemned for good, The Dialogue Between the Two World Great Systems. And he started writing that in 1623, in direct, excuse me, voice is starting to go, in direct conflict with the church's injunction. So he wasn't even to think about it, much less write about it. Okay, but he had a friend in Cardinal Barberini, and when he became Pope, he thought that Barberini, now Urban VIII, would help him along with his book. Okay, and they had a little friendship going on there, and Galileo thought things now finally turned in his favor. Once we got rid of Bellarmine, things were finally turning in his favor. Bellarmine had died in 1620. And so Galileo continued to write this book. And then in 1632, he wasn't sure about where the church stood on this issue, because he was receiving word from his friends like Ceci that things had not really changed at all, Galileo. I mean, you might have some friendship going on with the Pope, but that doesn't mean that the road is clear for you. But he wanted to publish his book, knowing that he was told not to do it, like 16 years earlier. And he got the book published in secret, basically, in Florence instead of Rome. He got an imprimatur for the book, I should say. And then it was published. He got an imprimatur from Father Riccardi. And Father Riccardi was sort of a weak personality, and he was highly influenced by the Archduke of Tuscany, Cosimo Medici II, who was favorable to Galileo. Okay, and Cosimo got his niece to hold a party, and Father Riccardi and Galileo were invited in Florence, and they got Father Riccardi inebriated, and he soon, under the pressure of all of Cosimo Medici's friends and colleagues, he convinced Father Riccardi, and I don't know if there's any other threats going on there, but convinced Riccardi to give an imprimatur to Galileo's book. All right, all under the table, so to speak. Okay, so Galileo had his enemies in Florence, the League of Pigeons, as he called them, and they told Pope Urban VIII of what Galileo had done. So, and at this time, Pope Urban VIII had been writing letters to Cosimo Medici II and telling him how bad a doctrine it was that Galileo was promoting, and how it would literally destroy the church, Pope Urban VIII. And he was writing back and forth to the Archduke of Tuscany for about 6 months, about a letter a month. And it was carried back and forth by the ambassador Niccolini. But from these letters that Pope Urban VIII, it dispels the myth that he had condemned Galileo's book because he thought that Galileo was making him look like a simpleton in the book. Actually, the guy's name is Simplicicus. So people would take from that Simplicicus was Galileo's way of representing the Pope. And people think that the Pope took offense at that. That's a myth. Okay? Total, absolute myth. There's no material evidence from the highest Galileo scholars that we have available today. That's a total myth. The opposite is true. The opposite is that the Pope, as I said, had been writing these letters to the Archduke of Tuscany telling him that this was a out-and-out heresy and that it would destroy Christianity. The language is so strong. I was so amazed when I read it. And I just put a few of them in my book, Galileo is Wrong. That's the 3rd volume that talks about the history, by the way. So if you want to get some bird's eye view of what was going on there in the mind of Urban VIII before he condemned Galileo, you should read those passages. So the Pope put him on trial, told him, you better get yourself down here from Florence. And Galileo tried to delay it. The Pope gave him a little grace and said, you still better get your carcass down here for a trial because you have basically, stuck your nose up at the magisterium all the way back from 1616 when they told you not even to talk about it, much less write a book, and then you go get an imprimatur on the sly, you're in big trouble, buddy. Okay? So that's, and then basically all Urban VIII did was reiterate what was said at the 1616 trial of Galileo, about those 2 things I told you about the sun and the moon. I'm sorry, the sun and the earth. One was formally heretical and the other was philosophically absurd. So that's what he was condemned for. Okay? Before him, in 1615, there was a priest, Father Foscarini. He was condemned. His book was condemned by the church. So that was a whole year before Galileo had even entered the picture. His book was condemned because it tried to treat heliocentrism as a fact. All right. Galileo hadn't written the book. He had actually written 2 letters, but they were to influential people. Okay, so that you might as well write a book if you're going to write letters to 2 influential people, and one of them was the wife of Cosimo Medici II. Okay, Christina, and she basically posed a $64,000 question at a dinner party one night and said, "Is it true that we can say that the Earth moves?" And the answer that came back from Galileo was, "Why, yes, of course we can." And then he proceeded to follow it up with a letter to her. And once you put your thoughts to writing, yeah, they have a way of being used as evidence against you. All right? And that's what happened to Galileo. So he was censored for those letters that he wrote. Another one was to his best friend, Benedetto Castelli, and that eventually was publicized. And so there you have it. Okay? So let me see. We got 1 minute left. Lopez says, "Hello, Robert. Do you think we'll ever know for sure if, in fact, that there are aliens somewhere out there? Thank you." I cover this topic in my commentary on Genesis, and you'll see there, I forget, it's like 2/3 of the way through in one of the footnotes. The strongest statement we have from the church on this issue is from Pius II, who said that there are no aliens on other planets. Okay? There is no other creation that God made other than this one, with beings on it and animals, particularly human beings. Okay? So that is from the Pope. Now, I'm trying to remember what the document title is. I don't remember it now. But just remember Pius II. If you have trouble finding it, let me know. I'll give you the reference for it. It's in Denzinger, by the way. All right. Adam says, thank you for your answer. How do you define theistic evolution and progressive creationism, and what do you see as the biggest problem with these views, both biblically and scientifically? Well, theistic evolution basically says that man evolved from apes. Apes evolved from something prior, okay? Until we get down to the molecule. And what the theistic evolutionist says is that God programmed the creation from the beginning to evolve, okay? And did it in such a way where he would not have to intervene again, that it would basically evolve all by itself, by the mechanisms that he put in it, okay? So they can have their cake and eat it too. They can say that God's involved, and therefore they're not atheists, like most of the secular evolutionists are. And on the other side, they can eat it too because they have evolution, and they can rub shoulders with the upper echelon scientists of the world and declare that they're evolutionists. All right, and that's unfortunately what we have the most of at the Pontifical Academy of Science in Rome. All of them are evolutionists. Okay, and they'll probably declare themselves theistic evolutionists, but they're all evolutionists, and they won't let one creationist on the Pontifical Academy of Science, and there's about 100 members. Okay, so that shows you where the thinking is today on this. Now, progressive creationism is a little different because it says that God created certain things, and then to fill the gap, to go to the next stage, he had to intervene and create some more things. And then when that reached its limit, he had to come in and intervene again and create some more things so that there would be this constant progression from the simple to the more complex. Okay? So it's progressive in the sense that God intervenes in a progressive scale. All right? So there you have it. So there, it's like, it's also evolution, except God's a little bit more involved than he was with the theistic evolutionist scheme. Okay? Now, the other side, of course, is, strict creationism. That is, the days of Genesis are 24 hours long. And there's no reason why they shouldn't be. And that the progression is just as the days of Genesis said. In the first day, you have the earth created. And if it means heavens in the sense, but they're empty, there's nothing there. So you have empty heavens, and you basically have an empty earth. That's why it says it's void and formless, okay? And darkness is upon the face of the deep because there's no light. So the earth is the first thing created, but it's unadorned, all right? And then the second day, still on the first day, God said, and let there be light, and there was light, okay? And on the second day, God creates the firmament, which is space. And that space is used to separate the water that had enveloped the earth. Okay, so basically you have this little tiny seed earth, and you have this big mass of water around the earth. And so that water has to be taken away, and that's what the space does. It moves this water out into outer space, and it leaves this tiny little seed earth there. Okay, and the verses say that it left a little water on the earth. Those are our oceans, rivers, and lakes. Okay, but most of that water was taken away into outer space. Then on the third day, you have the plants that are created, because now you have a pristine environment. You have water and land for the plants. You have the light, which gives photosynthesis to the plants, and so the plants are created, the trees, and all the plants. So, but then because if you kept the light that was originally made, that would be too big and too hot. Okay, because you got to remember, if the water was around the earth in the beginning, because it says, and water was upon the face of the deep. I'm sorry, darkness was upon the face of the deep. The deep there is the water. Okay. If there's no light, what form was that water in? Ice. Okay. That's what St. Hildegard tells us, as a matter of fact. That it was ice. So you had this big, massive bowl of ice with this little seed of the earth in the middle of it. All right. So how are you going to get rid of this ice? Well, you have to bring the light. And that light has to be massive in order to melt this ice, turn it into water, so that you can now separate that water to move it, and you leave a little bit of liquid water on the earth, you see. So you have to have this big, massive light in order to do that. Tremendous amounts of energy to do that, all right? And so that's why I just killed a mosquito there. Well, that's why the Genesis record puts it the way it does. Okay, why didn't it make the sun first? This is the big complaint you have. Well, you know, it can't be 24 hours because the sun was made on the fourth day. Well, there's a reason for that. Okay, if they would pay attention to the text, okay, you got this big, massive bowl of ice, you're going to need something much, 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 much bigger than the sun in order to melt it all. And then once it's melted, then the light is going to be too big, too massive for this little tiny earth, and so it's going to have to go. It's done its job, and it's going to have to go and be replaced by something a lot smaller, which is our sun. Okay, that's why it has to take over on the fourth day. Right? Because if the original light was there, we'd all be burnt to a crisp. Okay, and as the fathers say, that original light was now dispersed into outer space, and it was used to make the stars. So you can imagine how big that light was. If all the stars out there now were once this light that was created on Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, you can imagine how big that thing was. All right? Because that was basically the seed of the universe. However big that massive ball was, would create basically the rest of the universe, although there would be the firmament in between, which would be the space. Okay? So in scientifically speaking, the Bible has to follow that. I mean, God said this is the best way scientifically to build a universe. Just the way it's described in Genesis chapter 1. Okay? And that's why the sun and the stars come later, because they're not needed in the initial stages of getting this thing going. All right? So, you know, there's a rhyme and a reason why God put it together the way he did. It's not there to confuse us, okay? You just have to think a little bit. You have to say, God's not a liar, number one, and he's reasonable, and he does things for a reason. And you just, once you have that in your mind, then you go to the text, and you reason it out. Okay, God, I see how you're doing it. These are all necessary steps, okay? And you build the picture from there, okay? But, of course, that doesn't happen today, you know, because these men who have already separated themselves from God, and they've been doing that for the last 400 or 500 years, ever since Galileo, think that God really doesn't exist, or is, you know, not interested, or we've gotten them off the stage and don't have to worry about it anymore. And so they think they got a better idea. And so their better idea is just to reverse the whole process of Genesis chapter 1. All right? And we'll say that there was a big bang, and it created the stars first, and then eventually the sun, and then eventually the earth. That seems more reasonable to us. You see? Nice progression there. Yeah. Except it doesn't work. That's the problem. The Big Bang doesn't work. And they're slowly but surely discovering that. And as they discover it, they think of more theories, you know, that are going to replace it. And this is the way philosophy worked. You know, one philosopher replaced the other philosopher, and so on we go. But the glory of the Bible is it never changes. Yeah, the same story, no matter what century you read it. Okay? So it's high time that we take the Bible for its word and interpret it as God put it in there, because God doesn't lie. Okay? All right. I'm sorry if I haven't gotten in your other questions. I think we're only about halfway through the questions here, but please bring them back next time, which will be not next Thursday, because I'm going to take a vacation. And if I come back with a suntan, you'll know why, because I'm going to be laying on the beach. But I'll be thinking about you, okay? I'll be thinking about you for the next session we have, which will be the next Thursday. What date is that? Is that the 12th of September? Yeah, I think that's the 12th. So we'll be here again 7 p.m. on September 12th. Take your questions and see what we can do. All right. Thanks for being with us. All those that I didn't get to today, like Jonathan, Bob, Mel, Jim. Well, there's some long questions here. Joe, Maurizio. If I didn't get to you, please forgive me, and try to get in next time. Okay? All right. Until next time, we'll see you. God bless you.